The exhaustion was a physical weight, a shroud woven from 16-hour shifts, the incessant beeping of monitors, and the cloying, metallic scent of blood and antiseptic that clung to my scrubs like a second skin. It settled deep in my bones, a permanent ache that cheap coffee and stolen moments of quiet in the supply closet could never quite touch. My world had shrunk to the size of this emergency room, a chaotic theater of pain and panic, and the 400 square feet of my apartment, where the only thing louder than the rattling radiator was the silence of my own fear. Fear had a taste, bitter and acidic, like the bile that rose in my throat every time I looked at the eviction notice taped to the fridge, its angry red letters a constant, screaming reminder of how badly I was failing. Failing Lily. My daughter, my 7-year-old sunbeam, was curled up on our lumpy sofa, her small chest rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of sleep. A stray lock of blonde hair fell across her forehead, and my heart clenched with a love so fierce it was almost painful. Her inhaler lay on the cushion beside her, a silver and purple sentinel. The last refill had wiped out what little I had saved for rent. Every wheeze, every nighttime cough, was a countdown to a disaster I couldn't seem to outrun. The stack of bills on the counter was a monument to my inadequacy, each envelope a fresh stab of guilt. It was in this state of quiet desperation, hunched over the peeling linoleum of my kitchen counter, that I made the mistake. My coworker, Maria, had been joking a week ago, a dark, gallows humor joke about her cousin's gambling debts. She'd scribbled a number on a napkin. "He knows a guy," she'd whispered, her eyes wide with theatrical mischief. "A problem solver for when you can't go to the police," we'd laughed, the sound brittle in the sterile break room. I had pocketed the napkin, intending to throw it away, but in the blur of my life, it had ended up in the junk drawer, a flimsy paper ghost. Tonight, staring at the numbers that refused to add up, I pulled it out. I wasn't going to call. Of course not. But I typed the number into my phone, a masochistic little ritual, staring at the string of digits that represented a world I couldn't imagine. A world of final solutions. A world away from late fees and prescription costs. I almost deleted it, my thumb hovering over the button, but then a patient coded in the ER, and I'd shoved my phone in my pocket and forgotten all about it until I got home hours later. The catalyst wasn't me. It was Lily. She must have seen the number on my phone screen when I'd left it on the counter. She must have seen the tears I tried to hide, felt the tension that coiled in my shoulders day and night. She was a child, but she was sharp, an old soul in a tiny body who understood shadows better than she should. While I was in the shower, letting the lukewarm water sluice away the grime of the hospital, she had taken my phone. She had seen my ex-husband's name, Mark, in a string of threatening texts from earlier that day demanding money I didn't have. And with the simple, devastating logic of a child who believes in monsters and heroes, she had sent a message to the strange number. A plea. "Please help my mommy," it read. "Mark is scaring her again. He is a bad man. Please make him stop." When I found the sent message, the world tilted on its axis. The water dripping from my hair felt like ice against my skin. Panic, cold and absolute, seized my lungs. I tried to delete it, to unsend it, my fingers fumbling on the screen, but it was gone, fired off into the ether to a man who solved problems. My blood ran cold. What had she done? What had I done by being so careless? I imagined a loan shark, a brute with broken knuckles and a greasy smile. I imagined the police. But what arrived at my door 2 hours later, long after Lily was asleep, was something far more terrifying and infinitely more composed. The knock was quiet, precise. Not the frantic pounding of my landlord or the lazy rap of a delivery driver. 3 distinct, measured taps against the cheap wood of my apartment door. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I crept to the peephole, my breath held tight in my chest. The distorted fisheye lens showed a man. He was tall, impossibly so, and wore a dark, impeccably tailored coat that probably cost more than my car. His shoulders were broad, filling the entire frame. He wasn't looking at the door, but down the dingy, water-stained hallway, as if assessing the squalor of my building with a kind of detached curiosity. When he turned his head, His face came into focus. Sharp planes and angles, a jaw that could cut glass, and dark hair swept back from his forehead. Even through the distorted peephole, I could see his eyes. They were the color of storm clouds, a deep, turbulent gray that seemed to absorb all the light in the hallway. He knocked again, the same patient, deliberate rhythm. This was not a man who was accustomed to waiting. This was the man who solved problems. My hand trembled as I unlatched the deadbolt. Opening the door felt like stepping off a cliff. He stood there, a monolith of wealth and power, utterly alien to the peeling paint and faded welcome mat of my world. The air around him seemed to crackle with a silent, controlled energy. He smelled of cold night air, expensive wool, and something else, something subtle and clean, like bergamot. His gaze swept over me, taking in my threadbare pajamas and damp hair, and for a fleeting, humiliating moment, I was acutely aware of the chip in my coffee mug on the counter behind me. His eyes, no longer distorted by the peephole, were even more unsettling up close. They held no warmth, only a piercing, analytical intelligence. "Clara," he said. It wasn't a question. My name on his lips was a physical thing, a stone dropping into the placid pool of my fear. "Who are you?" My voice was a reedy whisper. A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, crossed his features, so quick I might have imagined it. He ignored my question. "Your daughter sent a message." His voice was a low, resonant baritone, smooth as polished granite and just as hard. "She mentioned a man named Mark." The mention of Lily sent a jolt of protective adrenaline through me. I squared my shoulders, trying to block the entrance to my home, to the small, sleeping girl inside. "It was a mistake," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. "She's a child. She was playing on my phone." "I'm sorry to have bothered you." I tried to close the door. His hand shot out, not grabbing the door, but resting flat against it, stopping its movement with effortless strength. His fingers were long and elegant, a stark contrast to the barely restrained power they held. The brief contact sent a strange, electric hum through the wood. "I don't believe in mistakes," he said, his storm gray eyes boring into mine. "And I don't like being bothered. So you will tell me about Mark." He was not asking. It was a command wrapped in the velvet glove of civility. I saw the edge of a crisp white cuff, the glint of a watch that was surely worth more than my life's earnings. He was a predator, and I had foolishly, accidentally, invited him to my den. My fear for Lily warred with my instinct for self-preservation. "He's her stepfather," I finally choked out. "Her ex-stepfather. He's nothing. A problem I can handle." He tilted his head, a gesture of faint, predatory curiosity. "Your trembling hands and the new lock on this flimsy door suggest otherwise." His gaze was so intense it felt like he was peeling back layers of my skin, seeing the frantic, terrified creature hiding beneath. He took a step forward, forcing me to retreat into my own apartment. He was inside now, the sheer size of him shrinking the already small space. He glanced around, his eyes cataloging the worn-out sofa, the crayon drawings taped to the wall, the stack of bills I hadn't managed to hide. It was a violation, his presence desecrating the one safe place Lily and I had. Then his gaze fell on me again. He reached out, and before I could flinch away, his thumb brushed against my cheek, wiping away a tear I hadn't even realized had fallen. The touch was shockingly gentle, a ghost of warmth against my cold skin, yet it felt more threatening than a blow. "I will handle Mark," he stated, his voice dropping lower. "In return, you will owe me a favor." He didn't wait for my agreement. He simply turned and walked out, leaving me trembling in the sudden, deafening silence of my apartment, the ghost of his touch burning on my skin. The next 2 days were a blur of surreal normalcy. I went to work. I bathed Lily. I made macaroni and cheese from a box. But everything was tainted by a new, humming dread. I expected a call, another knock, some sign that the terrifying man had been real and not a hallucination born of stress and sleep deprivation. Nothing came. But on the 3rd day, I found a plain white envelope slid under my door. Inside was a cashier's check for 6 months' rent and a receipt from the pharmacy for a year's supply of Lily's inhalers. There was no note, no name, just the crisp, undeniable proof of his reach. It wasn't a gift, it was a leash. He had bought my compliance, my life, and I hadn't even had a say in the price. The relief was so profound it made me sick to my stomach, because I knew it was just the first payment on a debt I could never hope to repay. Mark stopped calling. His threatening texts ceased. It was as if he had been plucked from the earth, erased. The silence he left behind was more frightening than his noise had ever been. The summons came a week later. Not with a knock, but with the silent, imposing presence of a black sedan parked at the curb when I walked out of the hospital after my shift. The windows were tinted, anonymous, but I knew. My stomach plummeted. An older man with silver hair and a deeply lined face stepped out of the driver's side. He wore a simple, dark suit and had the weary, patient eyes of a man who had seen too much. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice a gravelly murmur. "Mr. Gallo would like to see you, Mr. Gallo." The name settled into the hollow space in my chest. He opened the back door, a clear, non-negotiable invitation. "I can't," I stammered, my mind racing to Lily, alone with the teenage babysitter from down the hall. "My daughter, she will be perfectly safe," the man, who I would come to know as Arthur, assured me. "We have seen to it. This will not take long," though "we" was the most terrifying word I had ever heard. It spoke of an organization, of eyes everywhere, of my small, insignificant life being held in the palm of a vast, invisible hand. There was no choice. Arguing would be like reasoning with a tidal wave. I got into the car. The leather seats were cool and smooth, smelling faintly of polish and his money. The car moved with a silent, powerful grace, gliding through the city streets and leaving my world of cracked pavement and sirens far behind. We drove for what felt like an eternity, heading toward the hills that overlooked the city, to a world of gated communities and sprawling estates. My hands were slick with sweat, my nurse's mind cataloging the worst-case scenarios, none of which were as terrifying as the quiet, polite man driving me toward my fate. The house, it was a mansion, really, was a fortress of modern architecture, all glass and dark stone and clean, sharp lines, nestled into the side of a hill. It was starkly beautiful and utterly soulless, a monument to power and isolation. Arthur led me through a cavernous foyer where my worn sneakers squeaked on the polished marble floor. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of cedar and something floral lilies, I thought with a pang of irony. He didn't take me to a study or a living room. He led me up a floating staircase and down a long, silent hallway to a set of double doors. He pushed one open and gestured for me to enter. The room was a bedroom, vast and minimalist. The colors were muted, charcoal, gray, and white. A wall of glass offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. But I barely saw it. My attention was fixed on the man in the center of the king-size bed. Julian Gallo. He was propped up against a mountain of pillows, and for the first time, I saw him as something other than an unstoppable force. He was pale, a stark contrast to the dark gray sheets. His left arm was in a sling, and a thick white bandage was wrapped around his ribs, a dark red stain seeping through the center. The controlled energy was still there, but it was frayed at the edges, tempered by a pain he refused to show on his face. "You're a nurse," he said. Again, not a question. The command was still in his voice, but it was strained. I found my professional footing, the familiar cadence of my job a shield against my fear. I walked to the bedside, my eyes automatically assessing the wound, the pallor of his skin, the shallow quality of his breathing. "What happened?" I asked, my tone crisp and clinical. "A business disagreement," he said, his mouth twisting into a humorless smile. "My personal physician has a tendency to ask questions. I find it inconvenient. You, on the other hand, already owe me." He gestured with his good hand to a medical bag on a nearby chair. "The bullet is out. The stitches are new. I need you to change the dressing and make sure I don't die from some mundane infection." My hands were steady as I opened the bag. They knew what to do, even if my mind was screaming. I washed my hands in the adjoining bathroom, a sanctuary of black marble and gleaming chrome, and put on a pair of sterile gloves. This was my territory. Here, in the quiet intimacy of tending to a wound, I had a measure of control. I gently cut away the stained bandage. The wound was angry and red, a puckered gash stitched together with neat, black sutures just below his ribcage. It was clean, professional work. As I worked, cleaning the area with antiseptic, the silence in the room stretched thin. I was acutely aware of his eyes on me, watching my every move. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the faint, metallic tang of his blood beneath the antiseptic. His chest was a landscape of pale, silvery scars, old and new, telling a story of violence I couldn't comprehend. One jagged line disappeared under the waistband of his pajama pants. My fingers brushed against his skin as I applied the new dressing, and I saw him flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. In that moment, he was not the terrifying crime boss, Julian Gallo. He was just a man, wounded and vulnerable, his body a testament to the brutal world he inhabited. A strange, unwelcome flutter of compassion moved through me. It was a dangerous feeling, a weakness I couldn't afford. "There," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "It's clean. You need antibiotics and rest. And this should be checked by a doctor." "A real 1 inch, you are my doctor for now, Clara," he said, my name a soft rumble in his chest. He watched me as I packed away the supplies, his gray eyes shadowed with pain and something else I couldn't decipher. "You and your daughter will stay here. It is no longer safe for you at your apartment." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. "Stay here? No, I can't. My job, Lily's school, arrangements will be made," he interrupted, his voice regaining its familiar steel. Mark was not just an abusive fool. He was a loose end for some very unpleasant people. By asking for my help, your daughter painted a target on your back. By helping you, I made you my responsibility. You are safest here. With me, it was a gilded cage, offered as a sanctuary. I was his patient, his prisoner, and his responsibility. The lines were so blurred they had ceased to exist. I looked out the wall of glass at the city glittering below, my city, now impossibly far away. I had traded one prison of poverty and fear for another of opulent, dangerous protection. I wasn't sure I had survived the exchange. The days that followed bled into one another, a strange routine of forced intimacy and quiet tension. Arthur brought Lily, along with a few of her things, the next morning. My daughter, resilient and trusting, was wide-eyed at the scale of the mansion, calling it a castle. She seemed unfazed by the quiet, watchful men in dark suits who patrolled the grounds, or by the fact that our host was confined to his bed. She was simply happy that I wasn't going to work, that I was with her all day. She would draw pictures at the foot of Julian's bed while I changed his dressings. He would watch her, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. He never spoke to her directly, but once, when she showed him a drawing of a smiling sun, the corner of his mouth twitched upwards in the barest hint of a smile. My life became a series of small, domestic moments played out against a backdrop of immense, unspoken danger. I tended to his wound. I made sure he took his medication. I read stories to Lily in a vast library where the books were probably priceless first editions. In the evenings, after Lily was asleep in the palatial guest room assigned to us, I would sit in a chair by Julian's bed while he worked, his laptop balanced on his knees. He would take calls in Italian, his voice a low, dangerous murmur that sent shivers down my spine even though I couldn't understand the words. He was healing, the color slowly returning to his face, his movements becoming less strained. And as his physical strength returned, the power dynamic shifted back, the air between us crackling with an awareness that had nothing to do with my role as his nurse. One evening, Arthur brought me a folder. "Mr. Gallo thought you should see this," he said, his kind, weary eyes filled with something like pity. I opened it. Inside was everything. My nursing school transcripts, my parents' death certificates, my disastrous credit report, my marriage license to Mark, and the subsequent restraining order I had filed against him. And pages on Mark himself. His gambling debts, his connections to a small-time crew that had foolishly tried to skim from one of Julian's shipping operations. They had used Mark, and when he became a liability, they were going to silence him. And me and Lily, because we knew who he was. Julian hadn't just removed an abusive ex, He had intercepted a death sentence. The violation of it, the cold, clinical dissection of my life, warred with a dizzying sense of gratitude. He had seen the tangled mess of my existence and had not been repulsed. He had simply handled it. Why? I whispered, looking up at Arthur. The boss sees things others don't, Arthur said simply. He sees value. He protects what is his, what is his. The words echoed in the silent room. I was a possession, a protected asset. Yet, it felt like more than that. I thought of the way his eyes followed me as I moved around the room, the way he'd flinched when my fingers brushed his skin, the ghost of a smile he'd given my daughter. Later that night, I confronted him. He was standing by the glass wall, his injured arm still in a sling, looking out at the city. You investigated me, I said, my voice shaking slightly. He turned slowly. I am a careful man. I do not involve myself in matters I do not understand. My life is not a matter for you to understand. I shot back, a surge of anger cutting through the fear. It's my life. Mine and Lily's. You had no right. He walked toward me, his steps silent on the thick rug. He stopped just inches away, so close I could feel the warmth from his body. The men Mark was involved with would not have respected your rights, he said, his voice dangerously soft. They would have put a bullet in your head and left you and your daughter in a ditch. I gave you something your rights could not. Safety. His gaze dropped to my mouth, and the anger in my veins turned into something else, something hot and confusing. You're here because your daughter asked for a hero. I am not a hero, Clara. But I am the man who answered. The final plan was laid out 2 weeks after my arrival. Julian was almost fully recovered, the bandage gone, replaced by a livid red scar that I had tended to with my own hands. The threat wasn't gone, it had just been contained. The crew Mark had worked for, a rival faction led by a man named Petrov, now knew of Julian's involvement. They saw me and Lily as leverage. They will try to get to you, Julian said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion as we sat in his cavernous study. It is a sign of weakness they believe they can exploit. We will use that. The plan was simple. And it terrified me. I was to make a phone call to a number they provided. A cousin of Mark's, someone who is now working with Petrov. I would sound panicked, say I wanted out, that I was willing to trade information about Julian for safe passage for me and Lily. It was bait. I was the bait. I'm not an actress, I said, my hands clenched in my lap. You don't have to be, Julian said, his gray eyes fixed on mine. Just be a mother who wants to protect her child. It will be the most convincing performance of your life. He leaned forward, his hand covering mine. His touch was warm and firm, a silent promise. Arthur will be with you. Nothing will happen to you. I looked at his hand on mine, the strength and the certainty in it, and I believed him. The call was the longest 5 minutes of my life. I sat in a car with Arthur, my voice trembling as I recited the lines Julian had given me. The man on the other end was greedy and stupid, just as Julian had predicted. He took the bait. A meeting was arranged for the next day at a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city. When I hung up, I was shaking so badly I couldn't breathe. Arthur simply handed me a bottle of water, his expression unreadable. The next evening, Julian came to my room. He was dressed not in his usual expensive suit, but in dark, functional clothing that hinted at the night's purpose. He looked like a shadow, a specter of violence. He didn't say a word. He just stood before me, his eyes searching my face. Then he reached out and gently tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering for a moment against my skin. Stay with Lily, he said. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me or Arthur. And then he was gone. I spent the night pacing the floor, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I checked on Lily a dozen times, her peaceful, sleeping face a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. Every creak of the house, every distant sound, sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I was praying for the safety of a man who killed for a living, a ruthless monster who had shown me more kindness and protection than any good man ever had. The irony was not lost on me. He returned just before dawn. I heard his footsteps in the hall, heavier than usual, and I flew to the door, my hand hesitating on the lock. Clara, his voice came strained. I threw the door open. He was leaning against the frame, his face bruised and his knuckles split and bloody. He was exhausted, but he was alive. And he was victorious. I could see it in the clear, steady gaze of his gray eyes. "It's over," he said simply. "Petrov and his organization will no longer be a problem. You are safe now." Truly safe, relief washed over me so powerfully my knees went weak. I reached out, my hand hovering over his arm, wanting to touch him, to reassure myself he was real. He met my gaze, and in that moment, the world fell away. There was no gangster, no nurse. Just a man and a woman in a quiet hallway at dawn, bound by a debt of violence and an unspoken, terrifying connection. A week later, Julian summoned me to his study. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He stood by his desk, dressed in a crisp gray suit, the powerful, untouchable man I had first met. All signs of his injury were gone, hidden beneath the fine fabric. On his desk were 2 folders. "You have a choice to make," he said, his voice formal, distant. He slid one of the folders across the polished wood toward me. "This contains everything you need to start a new life. A new identity for you and for Lily. A house in a quiet town in Oregon. A bank account with enough money that you will never have to worry again. You can walk away from all of this. From me. And you will be safe. I will ensure it." I stared at the folder. It represented everything I had ever wanted. Safety. Security. A life free from fear and desperation. A normal life. I could take Lily to the park, enroll her in the local school, join the PTA. We could be anonymous, happy, normal. It was a clean slate, a perfect escape. "And the other choice?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His gaze was intense, unwavering. He didn't gesture to the other folder. He didn't have to. "The other choice is to stay," he said the words simply, but they were laden with meaning. To stay here, in this beautiful, dangerous house. To stay with him, a man who lived by a code of violence and death. To raise my daughter in the shadow of his world. It was not a choice between safety and danger. It was a choice between 2 different kinds of life, 2 different kinds of me. I thought of my old apartment, the smell of damp and decay, the constant hum of anxiety that had been the soundtrack to my life. I thought of the exhaustion, the gnawing fear, the loneliness. That was the life of a victim, a life where things happened to me. Here, I was terrified, yes, but I was also alive in a way I had never been before. I had seen this man's brutality, but I had also been the sole recipient of his tenderness. I had seen his vulnerability, and I had seen his absolute strength. He was a storm, and I had spent my entire life running from the rain, only to find that I felt most myself standing in the heart of the tempest. What kind of life would it be for Lily? I asked, the question tearing at my heart. She would be protected, he said, his voice softening for the first time. She would have everything. And she would have her mother, happy and alive. She would never know the fear you have known. I looked from the folder promising a quiet, anonymous life, to the man promising a protected, turbulent one. The choice should have been easy. Any sane mother would have taken the folder and run. But my old life was gone, erased the moment my daughter sent that desperate text. I could try to recreate it, a pale imitation in a new town, but it would always be a ghost. This, right here, was real. The fear, the opulence, the danger, and the undeniable, magnetic pull of the man standing before me. This was the life that had been chosen for me, and for the first time, I felt empowered to choose it back. I pushed the folder back across the desk. "We're staying," I said, my voice clear and steady. A flicker of surprise, followed by something akin to profound relief, washed over his features. The iron control he held over himself seemed to crack for just a fraction of a second, revealing the man beneath. He walked around the desk and stood before me. He did not smile, but his eyes, those stormy gray eyes, were full of a light I had never seen before. He gently took my hand, his thumb stroking over my knuckles. It was not a gesture of ownership or command. It was a promise, an acceptance. I had stepped out of the wreckage of my old life, not into a cage, but into the arms of the one man who was dangerous enough to keep me safe. And as I stood there, my hand in his, I felt not fear, but the exhilarating, terrifying sensation of finally, truly, coming home.